Dolores Vega had worked every single day for 43 years. She'd woken before dawn, pulled her silver-gray hair into a braid, tied on her apron, and walked through the doors of her family's diner in Tucumcari, New Mexico. She'd done this through her pregnancies, through recessions, through the slow, crushing decline of Route 66 as the interstate system swallowed the old highway whole. Her hands, weathered and scarred from hot pans and sharp knife blades, had wiped down the same Formica counter 10,000 times. But at 71, after her husband Miguel had died of cancer 18 months earlier, her children had decided she was no longer needed. Not really. The diner had been more than a business. It was the geography of her life, the map of her devotion. She could navigate those tight spaces in complete darkness. The walk-in cooler where she stored the green chilies and the fresh tortillas, the griddle where she cooked breakfast for the truck drivers and the locals, the register where she'd logged thousands of transactions with a smile that never wavered. She knew every crack in the red vinyl booths, every place where the chrome was worn through from customers' elbows, every regularity of the chimes that announced new customers. The diner smelled perpetually of chile and coffee, and the particular oil she used for frying, a smell so deep in her clothes and hair that it became her identity. When Miguel was alive, he used to say he could find her by smell alone, that she carried the diner with her like a signature scent. Miguel's cancer had come suddenly, though they'd all pretended to be shocked. Men of his age who'd worked all their lives with their hands, sometimes burned out quickly once the burning stopped being useful. He'd lasted 4 months from diagnosis to death, which doctors said was fast, which meant his body had been eager to quit. Dolores had left the diner in her daughter Teresa's hands during those final weeks, though Teresa had never learned the business properly. She'd been too interested in escaping it, in becoming something other than a diner owner's daughter. Miguel died on a Tuesday, and Dolores had returned to the diner on Thursday, because customers still needed to eat, because the business of living didn't stop for the business of dying. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March, 6 months after Miguel's funeral. It was Marcus, her oldest son, calling from his real estate office in Albuquerque. She could hear him tapping his fingers on his desk, that habit he had when he was impatient to be somewhere else. He was always impatient to be somewhere else, always looking past the person in front of him, toward the next person, the next deal, the next thing that might improve his position in the world. He told her that he and his sister Teresa had made a decision. It was time for her to stop living alone in the house, the one Miguel had built with his own hands 30 years ago. The mortgage was paid off, yes, but there were property taxes, home insurance, maintenance, and she was getting older. Didn't she want to be closer to family? They'd found her a nice apartment in Albuquerque, he said, affordable, close to family. The building had a manager who could help her if she had a fall, help her remember things. He'd already put the house on the market without asking her permission. The real estate agent was already showing it. Dolores had sat at her kitchen table, the phone pressed to her ear, and said nothing. She'd stared at the calendar on the wall, the one with the holy saints that her mother had given her 40 years ago. Saint Jerome, Saint Francis, La Virgen de Guadalupe watching over the days with painted eyes. Miguel's wedding ring was still on her finger. The house still smelled like him, like the chili he'd been smoking on the back patio just days before the hospital visit that never ended. The kitchen still had the coffee cup he'd left on the counter, the one with the chip on the rim that he always drank from, because he claimed it made the coffee taste better. But Marcus was already explaining the financial details, speaking quickly, the way he always did, when he didn't want to hear her objections. the way he'd spoken to her since he was 20 years old, a tone that said, "Listen, don't interrupt, you'll understand when I'm finished." And the answer is already decided. The house sold in 6 weeks. The realtor had agents showing it constantly, and Dolores felt like she was being invaded daily by strangers who opened her closets and looked under her beds and made comments about the property's potential. "Great bones," they'd say, though what they meant was, "old, needs work, barely worth the land." The proceeds from the sale went almost entirely to paying off the medical bills from Miguel's final months. The hospital, the surgery, the medications, the hospice care. It all added up to a number larger than she could comprehend. There was barely enough left for a deposit on the apartment, even one in a neighborhood where the buildings had bars on the windows and the neighbors screamed at night, and sometimes there were police cars with lights flashing. The apartment was everything Marcus had promised it would be. Small, cheap, and far from anything that felt like home. It was on the 3rd floor of a 5-story building with a broken elevator that smelled like urine and stopped working 2 weeks after she moved in. The walls were so thin that she could hear her neighbors' television sets, their arguments, their intimate moments. She learned that the family across the hall had a screaming toddler, and the man 2 doors down watched action movies at full volume every evening. There was one window that overlooked a parking lot where cars got vandalized and bottles were smashed on the asphalt at midnight. The carpet was a color that might have once been beige, but had become a patchwork of stains. The kitchen was barely large enough for one person to stand in. The bathroom had a dripping faucet that she reported to the building manager 3 times without result. Dolores arranged the few things she'd brought with her: a small altar with a statue of La Virgen de Guadalupe, the one her mother had given her when she married, some cooking implements, a few photographs in cheap frames she'd bought at the dollar store because she couldn't justify spending real money on picture frames when her life was dissolving. She hung her clothes in the closet, the faded turquoise blouses, the worn tan denim jackets, the dark blue jeans she'd worn at the diner. She organized the kitchen cabinets methodically, the way she'd organized the diner kitchen for 43 years, because organizing was a form of prayer for her, a way of imposing order on chaos. And then she sat on the bed, a mattress on a frame she'd bought at a second-hand store, covered with white sheets that felt wrong against her skin because they weren't the sheets she and Miguel had chosen together, and waited for her life to make sense again. Marcus called in frequently. His calls usually came on Sunday afternoons, and they were brief and functional. When he did call, it was to tell her to sign papers or to remind her of the other property, the one that was supposed to be her inheritance, but had become something worse. Her brother Raymond had died 6 months before Miguel, a quiet death in a hospital in Albuquerque, and the property he'd left to her was a condemned Route 66 filling station on the outskirts of Tucumcari. It was nothing, Marcus said, and he'd say it with the kind of certainty that came from never looking at anything closely. A liability, really. The land was too far from the city to develop. The building would cost more to demolish than it was worth. There was no water access, no utilities in working order, no way to make money from it. He kept telling her to contact the county, to have them take it off her hands, to relieve her of the burden of owning something worthless. "Just sign it over," he'd say, speaking with the impatience of someone looking at his watch while talking to his aging mother. "Stop wasting time on worthless junk. We'll handle it. Just sign the papers and let Teresa mail them in." Teresa, her daughter, had never actually visited the apartment. She'd called once on Dolores's birthday, but only because her husband had prompted her. Dolores could hear him in the background asking if she'd called your mom. Dolores could hear the lack of warmth in her daughter's voice, the way her daughter was checking a task off a to-do list. The way she kept the call to 3 minutes and then made an excuse about dinner needing attention. They'd never been particularly close. Teresa had always been distant, even as a child, more interested in books than in people, more interested in escape than in connection. But there had been a time when that distance felt like personality rather than rejection, when Dolores could convince herself that her daughter was simply thoughtful rather than cold. Now it felt like rejection. Dolores sent gifts to her grandchildren that she rarely heard about, a toy for her grandson that she picked out carefully, wondering what a 6-year-old boy liked, a book for her granddaughter that she chose based on age recommendations from an employee at the bookstore. She made recipes they would never taste, cooking elaborate meals for one person, practicing techniques she'd perfected over decades, but that now seemed pointless, since no one was here to eat them. She became the kind of grandmother who existed more in obligation than in presence, a woman her grandchildren would grow up knowing only through Christmas cards and the occasional gift. The days in the apartment blended together in a way that days no longer should blend. They should remain distinct, should feel like they mattered. But instead, they became a texture, a repetitive pattern of wake and wait and sleep. Dolores walked to the grocery store 2 blocks away, the same store every day, where she knew the locations of everything and where the checkout clerk, a young woman with kind eyes, began to recognize her and ask how she was doing, and Dolores would say she was fine, which was the required answer. She made meals that were too small for one person, making meals for 4 when she should have been making meals for 1, standing at the stove for hours because standing at the stove was the part of her life that had meaning, that had ritual, that had the weight of decades behind it. Her hands moved through the familiar motions, even though the result would be portions she couldn't finish. Food that would spoil in the refrigerator because she'd forgotten it was there. She sat in the thin afternoon light that came through her single window and thought about Miguel, about his hands, about his laugh, about the way he'd look at her across the diner counter and wink when he thought no one was watching. She thought about the diner, which had been sold to a young couple named David and Jennifer, who'd renamed it Jenny's Place and changed everything about it, removing the old photos from the walls, replacing the red vinyl booths with wooden chairs, putting in a completely different menu that had trendy ingredients instead of honest food. She thought about her brother Raymond, who had always been the quiet one, the one who'd never married, never had children, never seemed to want anything from life except to be left alone with his thoughts and his books and whatever secret he was keeping beneath that old gas station. 3 months into her life in the apartment, a box arrived from a funeral home in Tucumcari, forwarded by a church volunteer who'd been helping settle Raymond's affairs. It was dusty and taped with brown packing tape, the kind that was used for protecting things in storage. The label had her name on it in typed letters, formal and final. Inside were Raymond's personal effects, the few things he'd accumulated in his 78 years of life, which seemed like a surprisingly small amount of material for a human being's entire existence. There were clothes that smelled like his apartment, like cigarette smoke and old paper and something mineral, like dust from stones. There were bills, paid and unpaid, and receipts for small purchases. A book here, a meal there, the minimalist trail of a man who'd taken up as little space as possible. There was a small collection of books about geology and mining, worn paperbacks with notes in the margins in Raymond's careful handwriting. And there was a manila envelope with her name written on it in Raymond's precise hand, the script of someone who'd spent years doing detailed work, who valued accuracy. Inside the envelope was a single photograph. It was old, faded to the sepia tones of a memory, the colors bleeding into each other the way old things do when time has been working on them. It showed her father standing in front of the gas station, their gas station, the one she'd forgotten about, or maybe deliberately forgotten, the one that had passed to Raymond when their father died. Her father looked young and proud in the photograph, probably in his 40s, one hand resting on the Phillips 66 sign, a gesture of ownership, of belonging. He was wearing a work shirt and he was squinting slightly at the camera, as if he couldn't quite believe someone was taking his picture, as if he was still getting used to the idea of being someone worth photographing. The date on the back was 1952, written in black ink that had faded to a light brown. On the back of the photograph, in Raymond's careful handwriting, was a message that she read and reread, trying to decipher its meaning. Dolores, the ground remembers us. The tank keeps what the family earned. Check below. R. Each word seemed to contain multiple meanings, seemed to be speaking in a code she should have learned years ago but had somehow missed. She stared at the photograph for hours that first day, sitting at her kitchen table where the afternoon light was actually decent because it caught the corner of the building across the way. She held it up to the light, trying to see more detail in her father's face, trying to understand something from his expression that might explain Raymond's cryptic message. She read the message again and again, trying to decipher what her brother was trying to tell her. What he'd thought was important enough to preserve and pass along. The tank keeps what the family earned. What did that mean? For weeks she tried to interpret it, lying awake in her apartment, hearing the neighbors through the walls, their television sets and arguments providing a soundtrack to her confusion. Was it metaphorical? Was it a riddle about memory or inheritance, or the way the past persists in the physical world? Or was it literal? Was Raymond telling her to go back to that derelict building, to search for something he'd hidden there beneath the ground, something he'd protected all these years? The thought seemed absurd. What could possibly be hidden under an abandoned gas station in the middle of the desert? But it also seemed true. Raymond had always been careful about his words, had never been the kind of person to waste them on meaningless sentences. If he'd written it, he meant it. By the time the decision crystallized in her mind that she would actually do it, that she would drive out to Tucumcari and search that old building, she'd convinced herself it was ridiculous. A 71-year-old woman driving 3 hours into the desert to dig around a condemned building because her dead brother had written a cryptic message on the back of an old photograph. What could possibly be there? What could Raymond have hidden that would be valuable? The building had been abandoned for 30 years. Surely anything perishable would be gone. Anything valuable would have been found by drifters or demolition crews. But the curiosity wouldn't leave her alone. It gnawed at her in the morning when she woke, following her into consciousness like a dream that refuses to dissolve in daylight. It followed her to the grocery store, where she found herself calculating distances, wondering what road she'd need to take, what time of day would be best for the drive. It sat with her in the afternoons while she waited for the sun to move across the wall of her apartment, listening to the neighbors and thinking about Raymond, about his quiet life, about the choices he'd made. And underneath the curiosity was something else, something deeper and more necessary, something that felt almost like permission. Raymond had seen her. In his quiet way, he'd left her something beyond money, beyond property. He'd left her a message that said, "You matter. I've been paying attention. You're not as invisible as you think." It was a kind of love expressed through protection, through the careful preservation of a secret. And somehow, knowing that he'd done this, knowing that he'd cared enough to hide something and protect it, was enough to make her willing to risk looking like a fool. She borrowed her neighbor's old pickup truck on a Saturday morning, asking Maria, who lived in the apartment below her, if she could use it for the day. Maria, who worked in housekeeping at a hotel and understood about needing transportation, agreed without asking many questions. The truck was old and smelled like old upholstery and the residue of Mexican food takeout, with a crack in the windshield and check engine light that didn't work anymore because it had been on for so long. Dolores had never been much of a driver. Miguel had always driven, claiming that he enjoyed it, and after he died she'd mostly stayed still, had relied on the bus system in the city, had let other people move her around. But riding in the passenger seat of her own life had become unbearable. She couldn't ask her children to drive her somewhere, and she couldn't justify spending money on a taxi or ride share. She had to do this herself. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as she drove east out of the city, into the high desert where the landscape opened up and simplified, where all the complications of human civilization fell away. The apartment and her children and her reduced circumstances all faded into the distance behind her. Ahead was nothing but red earth, sagebrush, and the memory of her childhood, the geography of the life she'd left behind. The drive took just over 3 hours, though it felt longer, like she was traveling through time as well as space. She knew the way instinctively, her hands finding the turns even though she hadn't driven this route in maybe 5 years, as if the knowledge was stored in her muscle memory, in the inherited geography of a life lived in this place. The landscape became more desolate as she drove, the desert spreading out in all directions with a kind of terrible beauty. The kind of beauty that has nothing to do with human aesthetics, and everything to do with exposure, with the removal of all false comfort. The red earth seemed to go on forever, occasionally interrupted by rocks or sagebrush, the monotonous vegetation that could survive on almost nothing. Mesas rose in the distance, their tops glowing gold even in the afternoon light, their sides carved by thousands of years of water and wind. The road was empty, just her and the occasional semi-truck passing in the other direction, its driver not looking at her, too focused on the long distance and the weight of cargo. She thought about her father, about how he'd chosen this place for his business, how he'd believed in something here, in the possibility of serving travelers, in the permanence of a location. She thought about Raymond choosing to protect something in this emptiness, choosing to keep it safe all these years, to preserve something that no one else valued or understood. The gas station appeared suddenly around a curve, and she almost didn't recognize it at first, the way you don't recognize a person who's aged badly in the years you haven't seen them. It had crumbled more than she remembered, had given up more completely to the desert and the weather. The adobe and cinder block building was squat and weathered, the paint fading from cream to almost gray in some places, still faintly red in others, where the sun hadn't completely bleached it away, creating a kind of two-tone effect that might have been intentional once, but now looked like the building was shedding its skin. The corrugated metal awning over the pump island sagged like it was tired of standing, like it was waiting for permission to finally fall down. The Phillips 66 sign hung on a bent pole, swinging slightly in the wind that blew constantly out here, producing a long-forgotten squeak that she heard even over the engine of the pickup truck. 2 ancient gas pumps stood like sentries, their glass domes cracked and clouded with decades of dust, their numeric displays frozen on numbers that no longer meant anything. To one side, the small diner annex that had once served coffee and pie to travelers, the place where her mother had worked before she married, had partially collapsed, its walls fallen inward like the building had given up. like it had decided that resistance was pointless and had surrendered to gravity and time. Dolores pulled the truck onto the cracked concrete pad and turned off the engine. For a long moment she just sat there, her hands still gripping the steering wheel, even though the truck had stopped moving, her knuckles white from the tension, looking at the desolation before her. The silence was almost shocking after 3 hours of road noise, of the engine and the wind and the occasional passing truck. A tumbleweed rolled across the forecourt, moving with no apparent purpose, just following the wind that was always blowing out here. The wind made the Phillips sign creak again, that same sound she'd heard before, that ancient sound of metal straining against gravity. The desert around the building was pale red earth and gray-green sagebrush, dotted with rocks worn smooth by centuries of rolling, by flash floods and wind, by the relentless erosion of time. In the distance, the mesas glowed in the late afternoon light, their sides painted in layers of color, gold and orange and purple in shadow. It was the loneliest place she'd ever seen, and it was also the place where she'd learned to love, where she'd learned what family meant, where her roots ran deep into the earth, whether her children acknowledged it or not. She stepped out of the truck carefully, her knees protesting the movement. The air was dry and cool, smelling of dust and dried vegetation and something mineral, the smell of rock and ancient earth and time passing. She was suddenly aware of how old her body was, how much it hurt, how her knees protested the simple act of standing, how her breath came a little harder after the 3-hour drive, as if the altitude was getting to her, or maybe it was just fear. She locked the truck and walked slowly around the building, her sturdy brown leather boots crunching on the gravel, the sound loud in the silence. She touched the weathered walls with her work-worn hands, feeling the texture of adobe, the grit of decades of dust, the way the material had broken down from the relentless exposure. She could feel individual grains of sand against her palms. This place had been her father's dream, his attempt at building something permanent, something that would last. Raymond had died protecting something about it, had chosen to keep a secret all these years, rather than let their children dismiss it. That meant something. That meant it was real, that it mattered, that he'd seen in it something worth protecting. The office door was locked, but the lock was so rusted that it gave easily when she pushed. Inside, the air was stale and dim, dust particles floating in the slanted light that came through 2 broken windows. The space was small, just a counter, a few shelves with old cans of motor oil and cleaning supplies, a small desk piled with papers that had turned almost gray with dust. There was a calendar on the wall from 1988. There was a photograph behind the counter, in a cracked frame showing a family standing in front of the pumps. Dolores stepped closer. She recognized her father immediately, younger and broader shouldered than she'd ever known him. And there was Raymond, young, maybe 20 years old. And there was their mother. And standing beside their father was their grandmother. Their grandmother who had been Dene, who had brought the silver traditions to the family. The office was arranged almost exactly as she remembered it, though everything was dirtier. Everything was failing. Everything was in the process of returning to the earth it had come from. There were boxes of paperwork stacked in the corner, most of it water-damaged and illegible, the ink run together into blurry blacks and browns. There was a small wood stove in one corner, long cold, its pipe extending up through the ceiling like a chimney to yesterday. There were oil cans on a shelf, their labels faded and dented, products from companies that probably no longer existed, and there was an old warped rug that covered part of the floor in the back corner, a Persian-style rug with patterns barely visible under the dust, completely out of place in an abandoned gas station office. It seemed odd that a rug would be here, in this abandoned building, preserved while everything else crumbled and rotted. It seemed like something placed intentionally, something that someone had wanted to protect, something that someone wanted to keep functional and hidden. Dolores moved the rug. It was heavier than she expected, and dust rose in clouds as she pulled it aside, choking her with the texture of decades of accumulated particles. She coughed, her hand over her mouth, waiting for the dust to settle. Underneath was bare concrete, gray and cracked, and in the concrete was an access hatch. It was maybe 2 feet by 3 feet, industrial and functional, with a heavy handle bolted to the top. It would have led to the underground fuel tank system, the network of pipes and containment that had fed the pumps above for decades, the hidden infrastructure that made the whole thing work. She'd never been down there. That was her father's domain, Raymond's domain. Not a place for the women of the family. The space below that belonged to men and machines and things that required knowledge she'd never been taught. She thought about Raymond down there, alone, protecting something, keeping vigil over whatever he'd hidden from the world. She had a crowbar in the truck. She'd seen it in the back earlier when she borrowed the vehicle, old and rusty, probably left by the truck's owner years ago. She retrieved it, feeling its weight in her hands, heavy and solid and real. She used it to pry at the edges of the hatch, putting her weight on it, feeling the strain in her shoulders and arms, muscles that hadn't done heavy work in months. For a long moment, nothing happened. The hatch was sealed by decades, by rust, by the weight of time pressing it closed. Then, with a sound that hadn't been heard in decades, a grinding metallic sound that seemed to echo across the desert, the hatch began to shift. One corner popped up slightly, then another. She worked it back and forth, using every ounce of strength her 71-year-old body possessed, using anger and determination and the need to prove that she wasn't invisible, that her life still meant something, that she was still capable of discovering truths. Her face flushed with effort. Sweat began to run down her temples despite the cool air. Her breath came harder. And then, finally, the hatch swung open on its hinges, revealing darkness below. A darkness that had been sealed and protected, a darkness that now looked at her like a secret waiting to be known. She lowered herself down carefully, hand over hand, her body stiff and reluctant, her feet feeling for each rung. There was a ladder, rusted but solid, still functional after all this time, the metal worn smooth by repeated use years ago. Her hands were shaking slightly as she descended into the darkness, deeper and deeper, the air getting colder as she went, the silence becoming heavier. The air was cold and smelled of metal and earth and something indefinably ancient, something that had nothing to do with human time, something older and deeper. When her feet hit the bottom, solid concrete floor, not the uncertainty of empty space, she stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, letting her heart slow. Then she fumbled for her flashlight, the one she'd brought from the truck, and pressed the button. The beam cut through the darkness like a sword, illuminating the interior of a space that had been sealed for longer than she'd been alive. A space preserved and protected. A space that had been waiting for her to find it. The tank was empty, the fuel long since drained, leaving only the echo of its previous purpose. But bolted to the far interior wall, wrapped in old oilcloth that had been sealed with tape to protect whatever lay inside, was a steel vault, It looked like it had been installed deliberately, not as part of the tank's original design, as if someone had come down here at some point and attached it, had made this space into something more than it was supposed to be. It was roughly the size of a large filing cabinet, painted dark gray, sealed with heavy bolts that looked like they'd been installed with careful precision. With deliberation, Dolores approached it slowly, her flashlight beam bouncing ahead of her, her breath shallow, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She reached out to touch the vault, and the metal was cold, colder than it should have been, as if it had absorbed the temperature of the earth itself. The bolts took her a long time to undo. They were corroded and reluctant, seized by rust and time, and the crowbar wasn't the right tool for the job. She'd have preferred a wrench, something with better leverage, but she was stubborn, which had gotten her through 43 years of waking before dawn and working until her feet hurt, which had carried her through the slow death of her husband and the abandonment of her children. And the effort of working gave her something to focus on, besides her shaking hands and the wild thought that maybe she was wrong, that Raymond had been confused or joking, or that whatever he'd hidden here had been found and removed decades ago. That thought kept trying to take her over, to convince her that this was pointless, that she was foolish, but she pushed it away, pushed on with the work, pushed with everything she had. One by one, the bolts came free, metal on metal, the crowbar scraping against rust. Her hands blistered even through her determination. Her shoulders screamed. And then, finally, the last bolt released, and the vault's door swung open, revealing nothing but darkness and the shape of something inside, something waiting. What she found inside made her weep. The light from her flashlight caught silver first, heirloom silver, the kind she'd only ever seen in photographs, the kind she'd thought had been lost or sold or scattered generations ago. There was a squash blossom necklace, each blossom crafted with impossible delicacy. The silver blackened and tarnished by time, but the turquoise stones still glowing, still capturing the light like pieces of captured sky, like chunks of heaven mounted on silver wire. She could see the hands that had made it, could imagine the craftsmen working in careful detail, creating something that would last centuries. There was a concho belt, each concho stamped with patterns, geometric designs, flowers, symbols that she didn't understand, but that seemed to contain entire stories, entire histories recorded in metal. There were bracelets, bangles, rings, the accumulated silver of generations, the work of artists and craftspeople, the expression of culture and identity and pride. The pieces were tarnished but intact, preserved perfectly, and when she held them, they were warm, impossibly warm, despite the cold of the vault, as if they'd been warmed by the hands that had hidden them, as if they'd been waiting for her hands specifically, as if Raymond had buried them here, knowing that someday she would find them, would understand what they meant. But underneath the silver were papers, land patents from the 1940s, federal documents that were yellowed and brittle, their ink faded to shades of brown. The language was bureaucratic and dry, the kind of language designed to obscure rather than clarify. But what it stated, what it proved beyond any doubt, was that the Vega family owned the mineral rights to 160 acres surrounding this location. Not just the building, not just the property immediately around the pumps, but the earth itself beneath, the subterranean wealth, the mineral rights that could be worth millions if anyone cared to extract what lay below. These documents were dated 1942. They showed her grandfather's signature, a careful script, the handwriting of someone who'd learned to read and write later in life but had done so with determination. They showed her grandmother's mark, a signature that Dolores recognized because it was the same mark that still appeared on documents in her possession, the same careful hand that had written recipes and letters. There were photographs, too. Her grandparents standing at the gas station in 1952, her grandfather with his arm around her grandmother's shoulders, both of them looking directly at the camera with the kind of seriousness that people reserved for important documentation, for moments they wanted to memorialize. Her grandfather's hand on her grandmother's shoulder was a gesture of possession and protection both. Her grandmother's face was clear in the photograph. Strong, proud, uncompromising. She'd always heard she was Dene, but she'd never really accepted it, never really understood it, not until seeing her grandmother's strong features, her direct gaze, the way she held herself like she knew her worth. There was a photograph of her father and mother standing in front of the pumps when they were young and in love, her father's arm around her mother's waist, both of them smiling at the camera as if they had no idea what the future would bring, as if the desert would be kind to them. There was a photograph of Raymond as a young man, maybe 25, serious-faced and steady-eyed, standing alone at the gas station as if he was posing for something he wanted to be remembered about, as if he knew even then that he would need to protect something here, as if he understood that the family legacy would depend on his silence and his vigilance. And there was a letter. It was in an envelope addressed to her, in Raymond's handwriting, his careful script, preserved on white paper that had somehow remained white, despite decades in a sealed vault. Her hands trembled as she opened it, the envelope still sealed, the flap still intact, the way it had been placed here so many years ago. She opened it slowly, the paper brittle, careful not to tear it, and began to read by flashlight, sitting on the cold concrete floor of the underground tank, surrounded by her family's history, surrounded by the proof that she mattered, that she'd been seen, that someone had loved her enough to protect something for her. "Dolores," the letter began, and the shock of seeing her name in her brother's handwriting, the intimacy of it, made her stop breathing for a moment. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've had the strength to find what I've left here. I want you to know that I always saw you. When everyone else was looking somewhere else, when Marcus was looking toward the city and toward money, when Teresa was looking toward escape, when Miguel was looking toward tomorrow, toward the future he was building, I was looking at you. I saw how you made that diner shine every single day, how you put yourself into that work, how you served people with grace, even when they didn't appreciate it. I saw how you held on to your family with hands that were never allowed to rest, how you worked and never asked for anything in return. I saw how you loved, and how that love was not always returned in the way it deserved to be. I saw that, and it broke my heart. And I wanted you to know that someone was watching, that someone understood what your life cost you. Our grandfather had dreams of what this land could be. He believed in it with his whole heart, and he protected these rights for his children, fought for them legally and privately, though they chose to forget about them, though they were too busy with their own lives to understand what he was protecting. I've protected them for you all these years, alone with this secret, because I knew that one day you might need to understand something essential. You were never worthless. Your work was never invisible to everyone. It was invisible to the people who should have seen it, to your own children, but it was visible to me. Your love was never wasted. It mattered. It built something real. These things, The silver, the land, the rights belong to you because you belong to this family, and this family belong to this earth, and that matters more than anything that happens in the city, more than any amount of money or prestige. The mineral rights I'm leaving you are worth a fortune, real money, not sentiment, money that will give you options, that will free you from dependence on people who don't deserve your devotion. But more than that, I'm leaving you proof. Proof that you were seen, that I saw you, that your existence mattered. Proof that you come from people who built things with their hands, who owned things, who mattered in ways that the world couldn't quantify. Proof that your bloodline contains strength. Use this however you need to. Live however you need to. You have the right to a different life than the one they've given you, a life that's yours, chosen by you, not dictated by duty or family obligation or the expectations of people who never understood what you were worth. Your brother, Raymond. When she finished reading the letter, Dolores sat in the darkness of the underground tank for a very long time, letting the tears come, not trying to stop them, not judging herself for her grief. The flashlight rested on her lap, its beam pointing down, creating a small circle of light. She thought about all the years her brother had lived quietly in that apartment in Tucumcari, never married, never complained, never asked for anything, just keeping this secret, carrying this burden alone. She thought about him knowing the truth about her children, about Marcus and his clipped impatience, about Teresa and her distance, about how they'd both chosen the world over their mother. She thought about him watching, always watching, from the edges, seeing everything, and choosing to protect her by preserving something real, something tangible, something that would prove she was real, that she mattered, that her life had been more than invisible service, that she had inherent value beyond what anyone's love could measure. She carefully, reverently packed the silver, the documents, and the photographs back into the vault, arranging them the way Raymond must have arranged them, with care and intention. She resealed it and, holding the crowbar, climbed back up the ladder, her muscles protesting, her legs shaking. She pulled the hatch shut. It was heavier than before, weighted with meaning now. She replaced the warped rug, positioning it exactly as it had been, creating the appearance of abandonment, of nothing worth finding. When she left the gas station office, it looked exactly as abandoned as when she'd arrived, as if no one had ever been here, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. No one would ever know what lay beneath it, what was preserved in that sealed vault. No one would ever guess that under that cracked concrete floor, under the empty tank, there was proof of a different history, a different possibility, a different version of what the Vega family meant and who Dolores Vega actually was. The drive back to Albuquerque took 4 hours because she drove slowly, carefully, her mind already shifting forward, but also lingering in that sealed space, that vault, that darkness. She gripped the steering wheel and thought about what she had to do. She needed a lawyer, someone who understood property rights and mineral law, someone who could help her understand the actual value of what she'd found. She needed to understand what these mineral rights actually meant, what options they gave her, what possibilities they opened. She needed to know if Raymond had been right about the worth, if $2 million or $5 million or $10 million was actually possible, or if he'd been dreaming. She needed to figure out how to tell Marcus, and what she wanted to say when she did, how to watch his face change when he realized that the worthless property held value after all. By the time she pulled into her apartment complex in the growing darkness, the sun was setting far behind her, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded her of the desert around the gas station, the light that had illuminated the Phillips 66 sign as she drove away. The sky itself seemed to be affirming her discovery, validating her journey, welcoming her home. The lawyer's appointment took a week to arrange. She found her through the yellow pages, a woman actually, a lawyer named Sarah Martinez, who specialized in property rights and mineral law, who had an office in a building downtown with other lawyers, who looked young enough that Dolores initially worried she wouldn't have the experience required. But Sarah listened to her story, listened carefully, without interrupting, and her expression changed, sharpened, became focused. She looked at the documents, examined them, took notes. She called another expert, a geologist who'd worked on mineral surveys in the area. She made phone calls, spent time on her computer, talked to specialists in federal land law. She built the case methodically, piece by piece, and gradually, over the course of 2 weeks, the shape of the truth emerged. The mineral rights had never been officially transferred or sold, had never been relinquished. They'd been leased in 1952 to an oil company for a period of 30 years, but that lease had expired in 1982. The company had drilled but found no oil in commercial quantities, so they'd abandoned the lease without renewing it. The family hadn't received the lease payments in recent years. Raymond must have been hiding them from his more acquisitive relatives, saving them in some account Dolores hadn't known about, protecting them from Marcus and Teresa's greed. The land itself had gone unmined because the initial geological surveys from the 1950s had suggested that the mineral deposits weren't substantial enough for commercial extraction, but that had been 70 years ago, with different technology, different equipment, different market conditions. Recent surveys, conducted by someone with geological expertise, probably Raymond working with outside consultants, suggested that copper and molybdenum deposits could be quite valuable under current market conditions, valuable enough to attract serious mining companies. The mineral rights themselves were worth somewhere between $2 and $5 million, depending on the buyer, depending on the size and grade of the deposits, depending on current commodity prices. Dolores sat in the lawyer's office in a comfortable chair that Sarah had offered her, and heard this information as if she were hearing it from underwater, as if the words were traveling through dense liquid before reaching her ears. The words reached her, but seemed to arrive from far away, from another lifetime, from another version of herself. $2 million. $5 million. Money that was hers, that belonged to her, that she had inherited from a brother who loved her. Money that Raymond had left for her, had protected for her, had kept safe until she was strong enough to find it. Money that would change everything, her circumstances, her options, her dignity, her freedom from her children's dismissal and their conditional affection. She called Marcus that evening from her apartment with her name on the lease, knowing that she wouldn't be living there much longer. She told him she needed to meet with him and Teresa. She said it was about the gas station. She said they should bring someone from a law firm, that they should bring documentation, that they should be prepared for the discussion. His tone changed immediately. The interest in his voice sharpened. The impatience in his manner transmitted through the phone line shifted into something resembling respect. He'd always had good instincts about money, keen instincts, even though he had none of the warmth or generosity that might go with those instincts, even though his love of money was never tempered by love of people. The meeting took place in a conference room of a law firm in Albuquerque, neutral territory, a room designed to intimidate with its mahogany furniture and its view of the city. Marcus arrived in a tailored suit that probably cost more than the deposit on Dolores's apartment, his appearance a deliberate statement of status and success. His eyes were sharp as he looked at the documents Dolores had brought. The federal land patents spread out on the mahogany table, the geological surveys, the mineral assessments. He listened to Sarah Martinez explain the situation, her voice clear and professional, her facts buttressed by evidence. She watched his face carefully as the realization dawned, as it moved through his expression like a sunrise spreading across landscape. The worthless gas station was worth millions. The inheritance he'd told her to sign over to the county, to give away freely, was substantial. The property he'd mocked and dismissed and urged her to abandon now had value, real value, millions of dollars value. Teresa attended via conference call, her voice coming through the speakerphone from some office or home in another part of the city, sounding shocked, her distance momentarily bridged by the sheer size of the numbers involved, her coldness warming slightly at the prospect of inheritance. Both of them immediately started asking questions, their voices interrupting each other, their interest visceral and obvious, about the legality of the rights, whether they could be challenged, about whether they could be sold, what the timeline for sale might be, about potential profits if the land was actually mined, about what percentage of the mineral rights they might claim as her children. They looked at Dolores with new eyes, not the eyes they'd looked at her with before, the eyes of dutiful children managing a problem, the eyes of people who saw her as an inconvenience to be managed and minimized. These were the eyes of people seeing a bank account, seeing money, seeing value, seeing their mother as suddenly worth their attention and their presence. Dolores listened to her children discuss the money, heard the change in their voices, the sudden interest where there had been dismissal, and she felt something shift in her chest. She realized that even this, even a fortune that had been left to her by a brother who loved her, even wealth and value and proof of her family's significance, wouldn't really change who they were. They would still be the people they were. Marcus, with his clipped impatience, his inability to see beyond the next transaction. Teresa with her distance, her emotional unavailability, her resentment of obligation. She would still be the person she was, a 71-year-old woman who had loved her family more than she had loved herself, who had poured her life into service for people who didn't return the investment. The only difference was that now she would have the freedom to choose how to feel about that, to choose whether to let it define her any longer, to choose a different life if she wanted one. "I'm not selling the mineral rights," she said quietly, speaking for the first time since the meeting had begun, her voice cutting through the chatter like a blade. All the legal talk stopped. Marcus and Teresa looked at her as if she'd spoken in a language they didn't understand, as if she'd said something incomprehensible, as if she'd betrayed a basic assumption about how the world worked. "The land has been in our family for 80 years. Raymond protected it for a reason, not to make money quickly, not to cash it in, but to preserve something that belonged to us, that we belong to. I'm going to keep it, and I'm going to restore the gas station. I'm going to make it into something beautiful, something that honors what our family built there, something that shows that we mattered, that we were here." The restoration took years, not months. Years of planning and construction and endless conversations about materials and authenticity and preservation. Dolores moved out of her apartment in Albuquerque and into a small trailer on the property while the work was happening, watching the transformation unfold day by day. She hired architects and contractors who understood what she was trying to do, who cared about the vision. She found people who understood Route 66 history deeply, who loved the old highway and what it had meant to American culture, who wanted to preserve the buildings that represented a particular moment in time. She spent money, some of it from the royalties, some of it from her own careful accumulation, to fix the leaking roof, to restore the adobe walls that had been crumbling, to replace the broken windows with period-appropriate glass that let the light in properly. She installed modern utilities, updated electrical, plumbing, HVAC, while keeping the historical aesthetic, hiding the modern necessities behind period-correct facades. She took the old diner annex that had collapsed and gradually rebuilt it, recovered it, furnished it with period pieces that she found at auctions and antique shops, recreating what it might have felt like to sit there and drink coffee and eat pie, the way her mother had done before she married. And gradually, after the station was restored, after the diner was rebuilt, after the museum space was filled with the photographs and documents and story of her family, she moved into an apartment above the office. It wasn't fancy. She didn't need fancy anymore, didn't need to impress anyone with her choices, but it had windows on 3 sides, windows that opened to the full desert landscape, windows that looked out at the desert proper, at the mesas in the distance, at the sky that changed color with every hour. It had a view of the restored pumps, the refurbished Phillips 66 sign, the forecourt where tourists now came to take pictures and listen to stories. Every morning she could wake up and see the place her father had believed in, the place her brother had protected all those years, the place that had been trying to tell her, in its slow decay and persistent beauty, that she mattered, that she came from something real. Marcus tried to reconnect. He called more frequently than he had before, started mentioning that he'd like to visit the restored station, that he was interested in the history, that the restoration was impressive work. He mentioned, in passing, that his real estate business was struggling in the current market, that an investment opportunity had fallen through and left him overextended. He suggested that maybe they should discuss how the mineral royalties could help his family, how Dolores could perhaps invest in his business ventures, how her newfound wealth could benefit everyone. Dolores listened politely to all of it, asked him questions about his children's schooling, wished him well in his endeavors, acknowledged that the restoration had been meaningful work, but she kept him at a distance that was measured but kind, a distance learned from her mother, from her grandmother, the language of generosity expressed through boundaries, the art of loving someone while refusing to save them from the consequences of their own choices. She donated a portion of the mineral royalties to establish a scholarship fund in Raymond's name for young people from the region studying geology and environmental science. She donated to Route 66 preservation efforts. She gave to the local Diné community and to causes that honored indigenous culture and history. But what she would not do was give to Marcus, would not allow him to treat her newfound wealth as a solution to his own failures, would not let him rewrite their history just because the story had changed. Teresa called occasionally, mostly on holidays like she had before, with the same dutiful detachment, now just performed via a phone that was placed on speaker in the background of whatever more important activity was happening in her life. She seemed confused by her mother's choices. Why would Dolores choose to live alone in the desert when she could have lived in Albuquerque, closer to family, easier to visit, more convenient? She kept asking when Dolores was going to sell the property, or at least when she was going to sell the mineral rights and retire somewhere more comfortable, somewhere that didn't require her to work at 73 years old. But Dolores found that she was happier in the desert than she'd ever been in the city, happier than she'd ever been in the apartment or in the diner or in any of the places where she'd spent her life serving others. She found a rhythm of days that felt genuinely her own, that reflected her choices rather than obligation or necessity. She worked on restoration projects, hired contractors and architects, oversaw the careful preservation of Route 66 history. She cooked in the rebuilt diner, making the recipes she loved, serving coffee and pie to tourists driving Route 66, listening to their stories of roads traveled and places visited, of the highways that had connected them to their families and their dreams. She collected stories. She participated in Route 66 preservation associations. She used her hands for work that she chose for the first time in her life. On quiet afternoons, when the wind moved through the sagebrush and the mesas glowed in the distance, turning golden and purple in the late light, Dolores would stand at the restored gas station and think about her brother. She'd think about how he'd spent his entire adult life protecting something, asking for nothing in return, never seeking recognition, never needing thanks or acknowledgement. She'd think about how love sometimes looked like small, quiet actions, like preservation, like patience, like the willingness to see someone when they were invisible to everyone else, like choosing to protect something because you understood its value even when no one else did. She would touch the restored adobe walls, run her hands over the Phillips 66 sign that had been polished and refurbished, look out at the forecourt where tourists took photographs. She would think, this is what it looks like when someone loves you. This is what it looks like when you're seen. The gas station became a destination. A Route 66 blog featured it prominently, with photographs of the restoration and the story of the Vega family. Travel magazines wrote about the family history, about the mineral rights and the silver, about how a woman in her 70s had reclaimed her family's legacy. Tourists came from all over, from Los Angeles and Chicago and New York, to photograph the pumps, to visit the museum space where Dolores had displayed the family photographs and artifacts, to sit in the rebuilt diner and listen to Dolores's stories about the old highway, about her family, about what it meant to belong to a place and have that place belong to you. Some of them recognized her from the news, the story of the hidden inheritance, the vault beneath the gas station, the brother who'd protected his sister, had gotten some local and even national press attention. Regional news stations had done stories about her. Travel publications had featured the restoration, but most of them just saw an elderly woman who understood something essential about history, about loss, about what it meant to work hard and not be seen, about the strange persistence of memory in these dry desert places, about the way the past lived in the ground itself if you knew where to look. The mineral rights were eventually sold, 5 years after Dolores found them, to a company with the right technology and the right vision, with the financial resources and the environmental consciousness to extract copper and molybdenum without destroying the landscape. The money that flowed from that sale, $4.3 million as it turned out, gave Dolores options she'd never dreamed of, never thought possible, never allowed herself to imagine. She could live as long as she wanted and never worry about money. She could fund scholarships. She could support causes. She could travel if she wanted, or stay put, which she preferred. But it wasn't the money that had changed her life. It was the moment in the darkness of the underground tank when she'd held her brother's letter and understood that she'd been loved, truly loved, completely and unconditionally by someone who mattered, someone whose love hadn't depended on her usefulness or her service. It was the understanding that her invisible service had been seen by at least one person, that her life's work had meant something to someone who counted, and that someone had protected something for her, not out of obligation or family duty, but out of love, out of devotion, out of the kind of grace that asked nothing in return. At 76, standing in the doorway of her gas station museum, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that seemed impossible, shades of gold and orange and pink and purple all layering together, Dolores felt a peace that her younger self hadn't known was possible, had never imagined could exist. She felt the weight of the silver cross around her neck, her mother's silver cross, worn thin by 76 years of prayers and touch and being present. She thought about all the women in her family who had come before her, all the hands that had built things with intention and care, all the eyes that had seen her, even when the world tried to make her invisible, even when being invisible seemed like her only option. She thought about her grandmother, who was Dene, who had created the squash blossom necklace with her own hands, who had built beauty out of silver. She thought about her mother, who had worked in the diner annex, serving coffee and pie, maintaining grace in service. She thought about all of them together, extending backward through time, all of them present somehow, in this place, in these walls, in the light that was turning gold. She thought about her brother Raymond, and she said a prayer of gratitude for the gift he'd left her. Not the money, not the minerals, not the land rights, though those things had freed her and given her choices. The gift was the knowledge that she had been loved and seen, completely and truly, and that was worth more than any fortune buried in the earth, more than all the silver and copper and molybdenum that lay beneath the desert floor.